Okay, welcome to Bio 340 Conservation Biology. This lecture is Diseases of Conservation Concern. I'm going to go through a large number of definitions, so you just have to bear with me. These are important to understand disease dynamics and how it affects animal and plant populations. First, etiology is the study of a cause of a disease, so it's understanding the signs and symptoms. And I think the best way to think about this is what are the individual responses of a disease? So how sick does it make you? Does it kill you? Uh, for example, epidemiology is the study of the dynamics. So whether a disease is increasing or decreasing in a population and how it moves through a population. The prevalence of a disease is the proportion infected with a particular disease. And so that ranges between 0, so that would be nobody has it, and 1, which would be everybody in the population has it. The incidence of a disease is the change in prevalence. So it's the rate of increase or decrease in a population. And we often think of this as some sort of rate. And the rate would be as much as time is important is the number of infected individuals. So incidence is often reported as 2 in 1,000 or the number of infected individuals per 100,000 or per million in a rare disease. The intensity of a disease is the amount of infectious agent per some standard. So if it's a virus and it's measured in blood, which would be called viremia, it would be sort of the number of viral particles per, say, cubic millimeter or some mass. Or if it's ticks, it would be the number of ticks per individual that you're looking at. Diseases have a certain morbidity rate, which would be how sick it makes you and the number of individuals that get sick. And it has a mortality rate. So diseases can cause death, and the mortality rate is the rate at which organisms die from having a particular disease. There's an enzootic cycle. So that would be for infectious diseases. That would be, it could be simple in that there could be a single host. And so like the common cold in humans, it just goes person to person. If we're talking about something with slightly more complicated, for example, West Nile virus, that is mosquitoes and birds. So the enzootic cycle would be a mosquito has West Nile, it bites a bird, the bird now has West Nile, other mosquitoes bite that bird, they now have West Nile, they can go on and bite other birds, and the cycle just continues. So that's the enzootic cycle. Infectious agents have a host range. That is the taxonomic breadth of infection. So a large breadth would be, it's not very specific, it's very broad. So there are a few diseases that even cross classes. So for example, influenza can jump from mammals into birds, okay? You have epidemics versus pandemics. So an epidemic is an outbreak. So if you just consider the normal sort of prevalence of a disease, and if it jumps into a much larger population, we would call that an epidemic. A pandemic is when it's throughout the population or throughout that species. So it's sort of a global infection. Not an individual has to have it, but wherever that species is found, that's where the disease is found as well. And that would be considered a pandemic. An epizootic is when you have a large scale outbreak and a new host, a new taxonomic host. So for West Nile, you have the bird mosquito cycle. So an epizootic is when it jumps into a new host, and that could be either people or horses. So that's an epizootic, when you go out of your normal cycle and jump into something new, and it creates an outbreak there. A reservoir is the normal host, and it's where the disease remains when not in an outbreak. Okay. So the reservoir for West Nile would be the birds. Okay. Spillover is when you jump into a new host. Okay. So when you go from an enzootic cycle, it spills over into an epizootic cycle. And you would say it spills over into humans, it spills over into horses, it spills over into reptiles, etc. A zoonosis or a zoonotic disease is one that spills over into humans. So West Nile, of course, is a zoonotic disease that spills over into humans. As far as we know, that humans do not maintain West Nile virus, okay, but it spills over into us. Reverse zoonoses or zooanthropognosis is the reverse. So there's a few diseases that jump into from people into animals. Okay. A vector transmits the causative agent, so things like mosquitoes. So I should say it's an organism that transmit the causative agent. So things like mosquitoes that carry West Nile, malaria. It could be a tick. There's several types of vectors. The definitive host, and this is really coming from the world of parasites, is where sexual reproduction occurs. You have a secondary host, and that means there's some sort of development. So the organism undergoes some sort of metamorphosis, for example, or it forms a cyst. A parenthetic host carries a disease, but there's no development. An arbovirus is given to those viruses that are transmitted whose vector is an arthropod. So West Nile virus transmitted by mosquitoes is an arbovirus. Same with yellow fever, triple E, yellow fever. There's a bunch. All right, a naive host is so when you have an epizootic outbreak, usually it's with a naive host. And a naive host is a host that is not or was not historically exposed to that infectious agent. So with West Nile virus, you have that came from the West Nile region. And when it came to the US, our population of birds was naive, and it was deadly to them. So it can be within the taxonomic area, so within birds, or it could be a naive host, or when it jumps completely into a new taxonomic area. For example, when influenza jumps from birds into people, okay, it can be very deadly. All right, our first disease is going to be rabies. That's an RNA virus, and the rhabdoviridae. It's transmitted by direct contact. So the way it's transmitted is rabies. The virus infects the nervous system, and it also gets into the salivary glands. When it gets into the salivary glands, it can be transmitted by a bite, or many times when animals are grooming. So cats, when they lick their paws, it can get in their claws and then be transmitted by scratching. If it's in the nervous tissue, it can be transmitted to scavengers that then go on to eat the brain and spinal cord of their prey. For humans, most rabies cases comes from bats, but it's also in things like raccoons and skunks and other mammals. On wildlife, rabies is a conservation issue for African wild dogs where it has knocked the population down. So there they give it to each other, and it's also in the prey they might scavenge on. In North America and in Africa, it's controlled by broadcasting a rabies vaccine, which is a little edible pellet that they fly around in a helicopter and dump around the countryside. And it works. West Nile virus and other flavies. So flavies refers to the flaviviridae. West Nile virus is just one of a number of important viruses, and I'll go into some other ones. But it's an RNA virus. It's deadly to naive birds, particularly the corvids, and corvids includes jays and crows, and then hawks and eagles are also susceptible to West Nile virus. And the reason why we know is because those are large birds. So when a crow dies, they're large enough that we see them and it's very obvious, and they often roost together. So when you get an outbreak in a large pile of dead crows, that gets your notice. And also at raptor rehab centers, when you have hawks and eagles die, you notice those things. And so I was at Auburn in the early 2000s, and the Raptor Rehab Center there had an outbreak of West Nile virus. And at the time, we didn't know what it was. The story with West Nile is it appears to have come from a Middle Eastern variant that arrived in New York City and may have even got a foothold at the Bronx Zoo, possibly. We don't know. There was an early outbreak there, and that's where it was identified. And what happened was a number of birds from Africa, like the flamingos, were not getting sick, but North American birds were dying. And so that would get your attention. And after 1999, it got a foothold and quickly spread across the US. And there was an initial wave that really did damage to corvids and hawks and eagles. And it looked like birds recovered, and then a second wave went through, and there's probably other birds that are affected and knocks their populations down. We're just not sure. We're not monitoring all those birds. We do think that West Nile has a lot to do with the decline in ruffed grouse. So ruffed grouse is the Pennsylvania state bird, and their populations have crashed, I should say, and the numbers are way down. And part of it may be due to some emerging climate change issues, but also West Nile. And those two things are not mutually exclusive, because West Nile, the vector is the mosquito. If it gets warmer, you'll have more growth days for mosquitoes, and that's what they need, is growth days. They need so many days at a certain temperature to go from egg to larvae to hatch out and then feed. And the warmer it gets, and the longer the season gets, you'll have mosquitoes out there for a longer time. So these things are not mutually exclusive. Some birds are highly competent for West Nile virus, one being the American robin, shown here with a fruit in its mouth. An American robin has been called a super spreader of West Nile, and that's because, being a highly competent host, if it gets bitten by a mosquito that carries West Nile, it'll replicate in its body and not kill the robin. And so you get high viremia, right? You get a high intensity of infection. So when a mosquito bites a robin, it's likely to pick up West Nile and then go bite a ruffed grouse, a kid walking down the street, and that's how West Nile gets around, right? So it's become established in North America and probably knocks down bird populations. All right. In North America, the genus of mosquito that is really important are culex. So culex are really ubiquitous. They're common. There's a number of species. They do well in a number of environments. particularly urban areas and suburban areas where they can live in gutters and sewers and paint cans and tires, etc. So I mentioned that West Nile is in the Flaviviridae. There are other flavies that are important for conservation. And so something like yellow fever, uh, it used to be endemic in North America, but it's really been knocked back and not an issue in North America anymore, but it is still an issue in Latin America, throughout Latin America. In fact, some places you need a yellow fever shot to get into the country. And we do know that yellow fever, unfortunately, can jump from people to primates, such as howler monkeys shown here, um, through mosquitoes. Triple E, Triple E is Eastern equine encephalitis. Um, so that's a flavy that is transmitted by mosquitoes. It's here on the East Coast. And there are a number of other flavies out there. St. Louis, um, there's a large number of them. Lacrosse, and they're all transmitted by mosquitoes. And these are emerging infectious diseases. So right now they're kind of simmering at low levels. Every once in a while there's an outbreak, and we're just discovering how important these diseases are to wildlife. Pox viruses are interesting because there seems to be a pox virus for all the animals out there. So there's monkeypox, it's called chicken pox, but it only infects humans. Um, and then there are pox that affect chickens, but they're not the chicken pox that affects us. And then there's poxes that affect things like seals, and they have a largely unknown effect. I do know that some marine mammals get poxes that are deadly. Um, in birds, what a pox virus will do is it'll infect the fleshy parts. So around the eye and around the beak, there's some, I don't know if you know this, that the beak is like your fingernail, just constantly grows. Yeah, weird, right? You thought like a bird grows its beak, that's it. Nope. It's just like a fingernail, just keeps growing and growing. But birds, by using their beaks, it actually gets just like dog nails. It can be worn down through use. Anyway, that area of the beak can be infected as well as bird feet. And what happens is it can cause lesions, and some of these lesions are so severe that the bird can lose the use, and actually the foot can fall off. A leg can fall off from these things, or if it's in the eye, around the eye, it can close up the eye. And I know that bald eagles have been infected and killed by pox virus. It's transmitted by direct contact and possibly mosquitoes. So this is one of those diseases that's out there, doesn't get a lot of attention, and has a lot of potential to affect wildlife. All right, influenza. So influenza is an RNA virus, an orthomyxoviridae, okay, which means the straight fungal virus. Interesting. Okay, so it is not a fungus, it's an RNA virus. It has a large taxonomic range, so its host range is very large, so lots of organisms can be infected by influenza. The nomenclature, by the way, is based on whether it's highly pathogenic or low pathogenic, so HP or LP you'll see out there. Add in the strain, so there are 3 strains out there, okay, A, B, C. A and B are the ones that are common in humans. Human, and then the nomenclature includes the human gluten or the neuraminidase variant. And so you put these all together and you get something like HPA H5N7. So that stands for highly pathogenic strain A, and then H5N7 referred to the hemagglutinin neuraminidase variants. And hemagglutinin is the determines the host range, and so that's the gene that is responsible for the influenza virus particle sticking to the receptors on the host cell, and the neuraminidase is related to how well it replicates. So that determines the pathogenicity. Okay, influenza causes outbreaks, epizootic outbreaks in ducks, chickens, pigs, and humans, of course, that we get influenza outbreaks all the time. Reassortment is common in co-infected animals, and pigs seem to be really good at reassortment. And what I mean by that is a pig can be infected by, for example, H7N5 and then be also infected at the same time by H1N1. And what comes out of the pig when it sneezes would be H7N1. So the viruses are recombining, which is interesting and also very worrisome, because this is how new outbreaks emerge when you get these reassortments. I would say there's an unknown effect on most organisms. So we know it circulates out there in the wild, but we really don't know its effect on wildlife. Okay, we do know when it's very large, obvious wildlife, such as ducks and geese, that when they die, you notice them. But if a small warbler in the woods dies, or a mouse dies in the woods, or a vole or a mole, nobody's going to notice. All right. Both highly and low pathogenic strains are common in birds. Okay. It's almost always out there, and they commonly infect ducks and geese and fowl. And when you hear about uh, influenza that jumps from birds into people, the real deadly strains, that's most common in Asia, and that's because it requires close contact. So birds, just so you know, higher body temperature, and for the virus to be activated, it has to be deep in the lungs of a person. And the only way to do that is to breathe in a lot of particles so it gets deep down in the lungs. Kind of gross, right? But you're doing this all the time. Maybe not avian influenza. Let's hope not. But anyway, so these outbreaks occur, these epizootic outbreaks of HP variants from birds to people happen usually where humans have very close contact with birds. In fact, having a chicken or a duck live in your house. This becomes a wildlife public health issue when it gets into the wild. And I'll give you an example of something that plays out in a lot of people's heads. So you have sandhill cranes, which you have a population of those which nests not just in Alaska but over in Siberia. So they nest there and they mix with these birds, um, other waterfowl that may pick up some HP variants and may jump into whooping cranes, and then these whooping cranes that nest out in Siberia actually cross the Bering Strait into Alaska and then winter down in South Texas. So there is a possibility they can carry these strains to Texas, all the way from Siberia. Uh, that sounds kind of scary. And keep in mind, there are people that are monitoring this. In fact, there's active banding programs where they take swabs of birds and sort of are monitoring the situation. So it's not like it would be a huge surprise. Knock on wood. Let's hope it's not a surprise. Um, so anyway, that's avian influenza. All right, canine distemper is an RNA virus in the Paromyxoviridae. Um, Canine distemper is interesting because it's called canine distemper, but it affects all kinds of animals, um, mostly predators. And I've seen raccoons with distemper. They look like they're drunk. Um, Whenever you see an animal acting strangely, this fox that I saw on the coast of New Jersey. If you see a fox or raccoon out in the middle of the day acting strange, it's very likely it could be a case of canine distemper. And also, um, canine distemper also affects large cats, unfortunately. Anthrax. So now we're into the bacterial diseases. This one's caused by Bacillus anthracus, and um, that bacterium uh, makes a toxin that's deadly to animals, and this is almost like the effect of the disease is almost like a byproduct. I don't think anthrax wants to be in a large herbivore, but it happens. But anyway, the bacteria replicates and then sporulates. It'll kill an animal, and then the spores get cast out into the environment. They're very resistant when they're in an environment. They can last for days and weeks, unfortunately. And then they get picked up by other herbivores because it's just like a dust that would go out in the grass. And we know that anthrax is really, unfortunately, it's deadly to a number of large African herbivores, including hippos and this poor zebra. All right. Mycoplasma conjunctivitis um, is a bacterium that infects the eyes of birds, and it's transmitted by fomites. So these are non-living things that get the diseased infectious agent on it, and then you make contact. So dirty bird feeders is the primary way that avian conjunctivitis gets around. And looks like finches are particularly susceptible. And there was a wave of conjunctivitis that went around and killed a large chunk of the finch population. Cholera, completely different beast. Um, that's caused by Pastorella multocida, and this also kills people, creates a toxin, and so cholera. There are outbreaks of cholera that get into people. Um, the one I knew about recently, more or less recently, was after the earthquake in Haiti. There was a cholera outbreak. So kick while you're down. But cholera contaminates water. So you drink the water, you get sick, and it kills everything. So um, I've seen outbreaks of this, not personally, but I've seen outbreaks of this in some reservoirs out west. And when it gets into the water system, you have to shut down everything. And what will happen is it'll kill some ducks. Those ducks will wash ashore. They get eaten by eagles. It'll kill the eagle. The mass of dead bodies attracts foxes. The foxes eat the corpses, drink some water, they die. And so you get this ring of death around lakes. And what you have to do is just round everything up and burn them. So you stack up wood and throw the carcasses on top, and you have a bonfire of infected organisms. It's very unfortunate. All right, Lyme disease. So none of those diseases require, well, none of the bacteria required vector. So here's a bacterium that requires a vector. Large number of viruses require a vector. Here's a bacterium that also requires a vector. But the bacterium is Borrelia burgdorferi. Um, the vector is a black-legged tick. So there are a large number of ticks in the U.S. Um, and so a number of them are competent, but the black-legged tick is highly competent. So it gets in the tick and reproduces, and this tick is able to pass on. This tick has larval, nymph, and adult stages. and that disease is carried through the different stages. And it's amplified in a community when a larval tick, these little tiny seed ticks, they're called, feeds on a white-footed mouse. If the white-footed mouse is infected by Lyme disease, then any tick that bites that mouse will um, will get infected with West Nile. So one mouse can infect many ticks, right? And so when the mouse population goes up, Lyme disease can increase in your population. When the mouse population crashes, Lyme disease will go down. What causes mouse populations to go up and down? It could be masting by oaks. So oaks can affect Lyme disease through by mediating the mouse population. All right, and also that disease is vertically transmitted. So when the larval tick gets Lyme disease and it grows into an adult and then has its eggs, the bacterium can be transmitted to the eggs. That's another way that it gets amplified in the environment. So we know that Lyme disease affects humans, it affects pets, your dogs. So we're not sure how it affects animals. It's very likely to have effects on things like canids, so coyotes and wolves, maybe bears. We're still not sure. Sylvatic plague. Remember the plague? In my mind, when you say plague, I think of medieval diseases, but the plague is still out there. Unfortunately, every once in a while, somebody gets sick, a human gets sick. It's caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The vector is a flea. So the way that people get it is this is out west. They'll come in contact with an animal, and a flea will jump off. I know um, a young man was killed when he picked up roadkill, a cougar, and he wanted to figure out why it was killed. So he was an amateur wildlife guy, and he brought this cougar to his home. He was bitten by a flea, and he passed away. So it's a pretty nasty disease with a high mortality rate, high morbidity, and high mortality rate. Um, in the U.S., it affects wildlife, and it really hammers on prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets. And when it gets into a prairie dog colony, it can wipe it out. And prairie dogs are important. So prairie dogs are not a dog. It's a ground squirrel. It's a social ground squirrel, not a dog. But these are important in the prairie because what they do is they build these tunnels, networks of tunnels, and they're considered a keystone species because many animals will use those burrows as homes as well. And the prairie dogs sustain a predator, the black-footed ferret, and a black-footed ferret is very susceptible to Yersinia pestis, and so and so susceptible, it's really caused a huge decline in black-footed ferrets, and there's less than 500. It may only be 300 black-footed ferrets in the wild. So when you see black-footed ferrets where they are, there's a lot of captive breeding programs in the U.S. So lots of zoos have black-footed ferrets that they're raising. Ideally, these we would be able to restore the populations. A lot of this loss has to do with the loss of prairie in general. And then on top of that, you have a highly infectious and deadly disease. All right, fungal diseases. So there are a number of fungal diseases that are important for wildlife. So this is just a few. Keep in mind, we're kind of blasting through these, and there are many more viral diseases, bacterial diseases, and fungal diseases. So I'm only going to cover a few. White nose syndrome is one of those that's caused by the fungus Pseudogymnoascus destructans. With a name like destructans, you can't be a good fungus, right? This fungus is found in caves where it's nice and cool, so we call that cryophilic. When you in our your preferred habitat is someplace cold. And what happens with bats? Um, if it gets into a colony, it's passed around because bats huddle together. When a bat gets it, they would normally hibernate throughout the winter, and they have these sleep rousing cycles that are kind of low wave, so they kind of rouse and move around, and then they go back to sleep, and then they rouse and go back to sleep. What happens when they're infected with this fungus? They rouse to a point where they'll actually fly out and seek insects. So they'll actually leave the cave in the middle of winter. And if you're an insectivore and you're looking for bugs in the middle of winter, you're not going to have much luck. And I was out walking my dog one time and saw a bat in a snowstorm in February. So that probably not a lot of luck. I can't imagine what a snowstorm appears like to a bat that uses the sonar or the uses acoustics to find insects. So anyway, the little brown bat, which is a bat that hibernates in caves and homes actually as well, but their population, we think they declined as much as 95%. So it really hammered some of the bats. Not all bats hibernate in caves, by the way. Some hibernate in spruce trees. There's a few bats that actually fly into the leaf litter. Like if you make a leaf pile, they'll fly into that and just sleep out the winter, which sounds kind of nice unless you get stepped on. And then a number of bats actually will migrate as well. So, but those that live in caves are susceptible to brown nose, and those species get hammered by white nose syndrome. Chytrid fungus, Chytridiomycosis, is caused by an aquatic fungus, Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, which means the swollen in the infected tree frog fungus. That infects amphibians, so salamanders are susceptible, so are frogs and salamanders. And there's other amphibians out there, Sicilians. They're strange amphibians. But anyway, what happens is this fungus, it's like athlete's foot or jock itch. It infects the skin. It thickens it, so it keratinizes the skin. And then the animals die from a lack of oxygen. So a lot of aquatic amphibians, so the salamanders that live out part of their life in the water, and then frogs that may supplement lung breathing with dermal respiration, they die because they just can't get enough oxygen. So this is really caused some amphibian declines in the tropics. The golden toad nearly went extinct or is extinct because of this. And there's probably a number of very rare amphibians, particularly the frogs in the tropics, that got whacked by this disease. And it gets around from pond to pond. A lot of it's probably humans on their waders and their boots and in their equipment that they use to go fishing, or to actually maybe even herpetologists may have helped with this initial spread of it. Now that people are aware, there's a big movement to clean your equipment with a weak bleach solution, and there's some antifungal agents you can use on your equipment as well. All right. In fact, we just heard a paper about cleansing agents for snake fungal disease. So snake fungus disease is caused by Ophidiomyces ophidiocola. So wherever you see Ophidia, it means snake, and myces means fungus. This is particularly harmful to rattlesnakes, and this is a rattlesnake I found state game land just outside of Jim Thorpe in Pennsylvania. And you can see 2 small lesions on its head. All right, protozoans. So malaria is caused by a protozoan within the Apicomplexa. The genus for malaria that causes malaria is Plasmodium. There's a bunch of species that infects humans. Okay. Falciparum would be, Plasmodium falciparum would be the deadly one, but there's also Vivax that infects humans and some minor ones. In birds, the primary species is Gallisepticum. So Plasmodium gallisepticum is very widespread, but there's a large number of Plasmodium species out there. The vector is a mosquito. So the malaria parasite is circulated within the blood. It also infects liver tissue, but when it's in the blood, it can be picked up by a mosquito and then transmitted somewhere else. In humans, Plasmodium falciparum kills between 400,000 and 700,000 humans every year. I should have underlined every year. So the current outbreak of COVID, it's about to hit 225,000 people. It may hit 250,000 people, so 250,000 people, but twice that are killed by malaria every year. So it's really unfortunate. Malaria also kills primates. So there are malaria outbreaks in primates. Unfortunately, some of the great apes, gorillas, and chimpanzees are susceptible to malaria. In birds, in populations that are naive, you get malaria outbreaks that are deadly. And in fact, here's a portrait of all the species on Hawaii that were lost to avian malaria. Hawaii didn't have avian, it was isolated, didn't have any avian malaria. And when we introduced mosquitoes and chickens, so chickens not naive to malaria, it's probably a reservoir for malaria. When these were introduced into Hawaii, avian malaria was escaped and caused the extinction of a number of really cool Hawaiian birds. Okay, there are a number of miscellaneous diseases out there. One is a transmissible tumor, canine transmissible tumor, and this affects Tasmanian devils. So that is a marsupial in Tasmania off the coast of Australia. And for Tasmanian devils, it's very deadly. It gets passed around by Tasmanian devils biting each other, and it's a cancer. Oddly enough, it's it's not their own cells. It's actually a line of cells from dogs. In fact, it's been traced to a dog that's now extinct that we think was the dog species that came over with the first indigenous Americans. So that dog lineage is extinct, but it still persists. The cell line still persists as a transmissible tumor. All right. Red tide is caused by a dinoflagellate that creates a toxin. And when you get an algal bloom, so when the temperature is right, there's lots of nutrients in the water, you get this algal bloom, the dinoflagellate dies, the toxins are released, and you get large fish kills. Not only does it kill fishes, if you look up video footage of the red tides that recently happened in Florida, it kills manatees, sea turtles, as well as tens of thousands of fish. It's bad news. Chronic wasting disease is a prion, so that's an infectious protein, and that affects the nervous system. And what happens is that the prion gets into the central nervous system of a deer, kills it, it dies, and then it's spread around by scavengers. So it goes right through the poop. It's out there in the environment, it can be picked up by more deer, etc. So I would call chronic wasting disease an emerging infectious disease. So historically, it was not a problem, but now it is becoming a problem. Diseases are not a problem just for animals. There's a number of important, very important plant diseases out there. So one is Dutch elm disease, and so that is transmitted by a beetle. It's a fungus, so the beetle drills into the tree to lay its eggs. The fungus, the spores on the beetle, and then the fungus spreads out within the vascular tissue of the plant, right? The xylem and phloem, and it essentially just suffocates the elm tree. So elms, Dutch elm disease came over into the States and killed American and water elm. There's a smaller number of other elm trees, and it changed our streetscape. So elm trees form this just beautiful kind of vase shape. And if you see pictures of sort of tree covered streets in the past, those were probably elms and are all gone. So elms still persist. Um, what happens is they'll reach a certain dBH, certain size, diameter, breast height, certain dBH, and that becomes attracted to the beetle. The beetle goes and then kills the tree. The tree, in the meantime, is able to reproduce, but what happens is there are no old elm trees, so they make it to early adult stage and then they're killed. For chestnuts, it would be very early adult stage that they're killed, and they're killed by a different fungus. Okay, this fungus forms a blister, and then the spores come out of the blister. And same thing, it forms like a fungal ring around the tree and just kills the top. Fortunately for chestnuts, they resprout, but unfortunately, um, they don't get much bigger than say 10, about 10 centimeters diameter. Can't answer that. I don't know how to turn it off. Anyway, sorry for the interruption. Chestnut blight caused by a fungus kills the trees, and they don't get very big. And it was so chestnuts were once the dominant tree in American forests, no longer so. And they're essentially a shrub now when they were the dominant tree. And they'd be several feet diameter. So they were huge trees in our forest. And so that landscape has changed. And the good news is that there's Chinese chestnut. Like when you buy chestnuts and you want to roast them, maybe over an open fire, those are Chinese chestnuts, and those are resistant to the fungus, right? So that was the reservoir of the fungus. We've been able to take the genes for resistance and put it in American chestnuts, and now there's GMO chestnuts, and so hopefully we'll get chestnuts back on our landscape. All right, diversity and disease. So this is community diversity. It's an area of active research, and it's a hot topic right now. There are two ways to look at diversity, and models suggest that it could go either way. And what that means is if you look at the relationship between the prevalence of a disease and the biological diversity where it's found, some models suggest that by increasing diversity, you amplify a disease, and other models have it diminished, called the dilution effect. When you look at, say, studies that actually look at this, and so I know one study that looked at, it looked at community health locations and the incidence of West Nile. And then they looked at the bird diversity in those neighborhoods. And neighborhoods that had high bird diversity had lower incidence of West Nile. Same is true for Lyme disease. Where you had higher mammal diversity, you had a lower incidence of Lyme disease. However, the data are noisy and the models can go, they predict both ways based on certain assumptions. For the dilution effect to work, what happens is, let's take a simple community where we know, let's take a highly competent host, robins. Robins are a common suburb bird where you have lower diversity of birds. So West Nile will become more prevalent because you have lots of robins and lots of mosquitoes. And so the spillover effect is very common. So you have high prevalence. You take if you look at the avian community in the forest where you have many more birds, you have hosts that are not so competent, either because they get it and die. And if you die, you can't transmit a disease usually. Or you're not competent because you are bitten by a mosquito that has West Nile and it's not amplified in your body. Your body's not able to increase the viremia. So when you're bitten by another mosquito, you don't pass it off. So the dilution effect means when you start to add in more species that are dead ends, there's less linkages of the disease, right? So it just has more dead ends. And so the prevalence goes down overall. Okay. And it looks like the dilution effect is more prevalent in the wild than the amplification effect, which is good. And in fact, we know that certain diseases that affect mammals in Africa, okay, you can protect your cattle by having other mammals around where the disease is sort of sunk into those mammals and not into your cattle. So an interesting use of ecological knowledge. All right, if you want to find out more, right, this is a really interesting topic if you're into bio. There's the field manual of wildlife diseases. It's no longer in print. I have 2 copies if you want to borrow it. Just great reading, great illustrations, and a great resource, but it's also online for free. There's the EcoHealth Alliance. This is a consortium of researchers, and they have a journal, and this is all about uniting sort of this, what's called the One Health. And that is a healthy environment has healthy people living in it, which then has healthy animals. A healthy environment would be a diverse community with all its ecosystem services. You can't get ecosystem services, a full complement, without all those animals interacting, becoming insectivores, predators, scavengers. Okay, that sort of environment promotes healthy people. So it's called a One Health. So it's looking at communities not just isolated in their houses, but you go outside and you're exposed to mosquitoes, fleas, all sorts of animals, right? So you can't escape this. It's just whether you acknowledge it or not. There's a Journal of Wildlife Diseases, which has rejected one of my manuscripts. So it goes looking at avian malaria. But it is a great journal. I love the articles in there. And also for easy listening, there's This Week in Virology podcast, and they often interview people from EcoHealth Alliance. In fact, with the COVID outbreak, which looks like it came from bats and pangolins were also involved, these things have come to the forefront of science. So it's nice to see that, although for unfortunate reasons. And also, This Week in Parasitology podcast is a great podcast to learn about infectious diseases in animals that spill over into humans. I think that's it. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email or give me a call. and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.